Thanks for joining me. This lab session is entitled Working with Functions Lab. JMeter functions are special values that can be used to populate fields of any element in a test tree. A function call syntax looks like this, where you have underscore underscore function name, variable 1, variable 2, and variable 3, and so on. The function name is a function defined. The function name value is encompassed in squiggly brackets and a dollar symbol at the front. If the function requires input, variables can be specified and enclosed in parentheses. A couple of examples are as shown. You see the one with the date, year, month, date format, and then you see one that the value is supplied by JMeter, and it's called a thread number. So whatever number is associated to the thread that's running, the user number, then that is what is supplied in that function. Here's a sampling of JMeter functions. You can find a full list of functions at the Functions and Variables JMeter site. I will use a short demo to let you see how this works in the test case we already have working. I am adding the date function to the test plan and inserting a debug sampler that allows me to see all variables that exist, including the one I'm defining in the test plan element. The final steps are to run the test and look at it in the view results tree. Let's start with the test plan element. We have the IDE open, we have a test plan, and we actually have a test script available. We'll expand it momentarily. First, I want to show you on the test plan that you have the ability to define variables, and typically what you show here is the name of the variable and what value is associated. So here you see a set date variable, and you see a function in JMeter that is going to populate set date with this value, year, month, day. Then we see another variable, tnum, that is set to populate it with another function called threadNum, and that should be the thread number value, numeric value. But you're going to see something that is regarding defining functions within the test plan area. Okay, let's expand this. We see that there are two scenarios. We are actually going against the www.example.org site, so it's one we can play with a little bit. And we're actually going to utilize two different scenarios or two different thread groups with regards to JMeter. One is going to run 5 threads, ramping up in 5 seconds and looping twice. No schedule is specified. The schedule is off. On the second thread group, we're actually going to run 5 threads, ramping up in 5 seconds, running forever, not looping one time, but as many times as it can within a 10-second time frame. And it's going to delay for 5 seconds. So before the test starts, the other test will have been running already for 5 seconds, and this will kick off but stop in 10 seconds. We have a view results tree, and we have a summary report. Both of them are outside of the thread groups, so they're going to handle collecting data for both thread groups. It'll all be mixed in together. We could define one separate for each and see a separate report, but in this case we will not. Let's expand the rest of the script right here. And so we have the same requests, default and cookie manager and header manager, but notice on the home page in both groups, I'll just talk from this one, they both have basically the same information. We have on the home page, we've defined, I put in the value, the text user, and then followed that by the thread num function and then the thread group name function. So we're going to pick up both of those values and place it in the name, and it will be dynamic. Same thing with page returning. That one will have users, and now I don't have a space, so you'll see that a little different. Thread num, you can do that, and followed by the group name. Now, the group name, as opposed to the thread number or the thread or the group number, we have the name is scenario 1 and scenario 2. So we'll see those in this heading information, if you will, or the name. It's a dynamic process that's occurring. Now, we have one more thing that you haven't used before, and that's the user-defined variable element. And within it, just like with the test plan, we can define variables. When we go to the user-defined variables, you'll see I have one called developer, and I put my name in it. I have another called tnumUDV, short for user-defined variables, because I already have one defined in test plan. I'm putting that same thread number in this user-defined variables element. Now, one more thing is the debug sampler. Debug sampler and debug post processor. The debug sampler I can put anywhere within the thread group, and it's set right now to show me the variables, the JMeter variables that were defined and what their values are at a certain point in time. I can turn on the JMeter properties and system properties, but those are off by default. So that's the debug sampler. The debug post processor is a little different. First, you put it underneath a sampler. So it will do processing for whatever it's subordinate to. So in this case, the HTTP request is what it's going to look at and provide data, in this case, JMeter variables and sampler properties. It's going to show them. When we look in the report down here, view results tree, we're going to see subordinate to the page name, there'll be another entry, and it will show us response data that has to do with what we selected here, JMeter variables and sampler properties. You'll see all that momentarily after we run the test. What else do we have to show you? So we've done the same thing in this scenario 2. It basically has all the same information. We're going to see that scenario 1 and scenario 2 will be identified on the page names in the name area. So you will see that separately. So it's a way of identifying that information more clearly in a dynamic fashion. Let's go ahead and do a save as normal. Now remember, I said something about that in previous demo, that if you go to tools, I'm sorry, not tools, options, there are two things that you can set. Log viewer, to have that on, and it will show that what's going on in the log, what's being logged, as well as save automatically before run. So anytime we forget to save, it's going to save anyway. If there's data to be saved, it will save it before it starts the test run. All right, so we're ready to start the test run. We click the start button, and notice the stop is visible. I'm going to go to the view results tree. You'll see it's running, still running. And we're done. So both thread groups ran in a parallel fashion. You can see home page user 1, scenario 1, scenario 1. Look at what's happened. We don't see scenario 2 for a little while, and then we start to see scenario 2 mixed with scenario 1. So that delay had something to do with that. All right, now let's take a quick look at the summary report. What does that look like? We can see, if we expand this a little bit, notice that information that you see now on the page returning and on the home page. We see user 1, scenario 1, user 2, scenario 1, page returning 404, user 1, scenario 1, and so on. We also see the debug sampler. We won't see any information here in this report, but what is important is what are we seeing? We're seeing the data and performance data having to do with those pages we're trying to access at the example.org website. All right, now what this is for is not only for you to be able to see functions and the use of it. Here we were able to use it dynamically in the actual names so that it shows up on the reports. Same thing in the view results tree. There it is. Now, what's important is we wanted to see this debug sampler and how that works. All right, so with the debug sampler, you'll see it shows up several times because it's in the loop process. So what we see are some variables that we define. Developer equal Wally. That one is static, and set date is static. But there it is. We are seeing those two variables. Then there are two other variables, tnum and tnum UDV. Notice they do not have the thread number in it. Instead, they have this word standard JMeter engine. And what's happening is those functions are not designed to be used in the user-defined variables or in the test plan. Test plan and user-defined variables, even though you can define it, but when you go to look at it in the debug sampler, you will find that it only has this value, standard JMeter engine. But when we look at the page names, we used it there, and we can actually see the number user 1, user 2, user 3, and so on. So be aware that certain functions cannot be used, and it's documented, whether it can be used in the user variables definition or user defined variables element or the test plan element. Let's move on. One more thing is the debug post-processor. That one was set, we wanted to see JMeter variables and sampler properties. When we go to the view results tree for the home page, we can go to the second level, lower level, and now we see all of these sampler properties, data and their values, what they are, and we can see those same variables that we saw in the debug sampler. We can see it here in the debug post-processor data, or actually the lower level page data. We see it as response data, and there it is, developer, set date, tnum, UDV are there. And of course there are some other system level variables that are showing as well, and some of those can be utilized whenever you need some start time data. All right, let's see, am I missing anything? I'm just going to look a little further down here. And I definitely told you on the summary report, you see those same variable names now. Instead of them being static, only showing home page and page returning 404, we now see dynamic data on those same lines. And something else we see is samples that are showing. And notice that some of them have like 9 and then 1 less. That is something you will see with the second scenario that's in a parallel mode. It doesn't get a chance to run its last sample. Typically, it gets cut off because of the way that we have it defined. It's designed in that scenario to run for 10 seconds. And when it reaches that 10th second, there's an immediate shutdown. It's not a gradual shutdown. So we lose one sample. Whereas in the first scenario, where we're defining 2 loops, we actually get 2 full loops for that scenario or for that thread group. So be aware that's a risk you take when you're running using the timer, the durations, instead of the loops. But there are times when you want to run as many cycles as you can, or as many threads as you can, for a given test. And so I'm showing you both in this test scenario. And that concludes this lesson. My time has ended for this session. I thank you for yours. Join me in the next video.